It's been more than 3 years since the financial crisis began in earnest, and yet to this point, there's been no major criminal prosecutions of the major players on Wall Street, and I exclude Bernie Madoff from that list. My guest today, Professor William Black of the University of Missouri at Kansas City, said the reason is there's an immunity doctrine, and it begins at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Professor Black, what do you mean? What is the immunity doctrine that you speak of?
You're right to exclude Madoff. What we're talking about is there is not a single senior official of the major non-prime players that caused this crisis that has been prosecuted. And, of course, therefore, none has been convicted.
Right. So why is that? Why haven't there been prosecutions? Is it a matter that, as some people suggest, that what they did, although it was disgusting, was actually legal, or was there actual illegality and criminal conduct?
Well, we know that there was massive illegality. That's what the FBI was talking about, that there was an epidemic of fraud. And the fraud overwhelmingly took the context of liar's loans. Now, whatever people imagine about the Community Reinvestment Act, it has nothing to do with liar's loans. Liar's loans, nobody put a gun to the head of any lender and said, you should be making liar's loans. They decided to do that. And they knew, and we've known for centuries, that if you don't do underwriting, and that's what a liar's loan is, you will create massive adverse selection and that you will have a negative expected value of lending. In plain English, that means you will lose money. Honest lenders don't do that. If you make these kinds of loans, in the short term, you are guaranteed to report record fictional profits. Of course, you create record real losses. And with modern executive compensation, that means you walk away rich. Then what happened? Well, then we bailed the folks out. And then we had the largest, most prestigious entities in America, and indeed the world, places like Bank of America, say, you know what we should do? We should have our loans serviced by Countrywide, because those Countrywide people have spent the last 6 years learning how to create fraudulent loans. That's a great business idea. And you know who did that before? Well, the folks that acquired AmeriQuest when 49 state attorney generals sued them for fraud and predatory lending, and the FTC sued them. And what happened? Well, Citicorp and WAMU said, those are the kinds of employees we want. And so they rushed to acquire them and created the new fraudulent lines. The underlying mortgage fraud leads to the servicing fraud. It has to, because the documents often don't exist. And so people who want to foreclose have to lie about it, which they did to the tune of 10,000 times a month.
Right.
Those are felonies.
Right. And we're seeing the same kind of activity going on in the foreclosure process. So you lie about the origination during the servicing and during the foreclosure. And we saw last week when Bank of America reported its results, it's still dealing with the aftermath of this. And I know you think that there are still major problems in the financial sector because of this. Do you think we're going to get to a point where the American people or some of our elected officials are going to say, you know what, we need to prosecute some of these people?
It's going to have to come from the people because it isn't coming from our government, any element. So the key to the foreclosure frauds is the same as the underlying frauds, accounting and securities fraud by the lenders. And that is the dog that aren't barking. The regulators are still rushing to try to prevent effective action against foreclosure fraud. What you're seeing with this settlement agreement with the banking regulatory agencies is a conscious effort to undercut the state attorney generals. Right? So the state attorney generals probably aren't going to do criminal charges against major officials. At least that's the buzz out of it as well, because they don't have the resources.
If fish rots from the head, is it the policy of the Obama administration and Tim Geithner at Treasury and the head of the SEC to not go after these criminals or what you're accusing of criminal deeds?
It's the unofficial policy of the United States. It's never going to be put in writing because that would be deeply embarrassing. But the de facto policy right now is elite frauds go free if they're in banking because the whole sector is too fragile. And that is significantly insane. It will produce the next crisis. It'll make the next crisis come sooner, and it'll make the next crisis far, far worse. And you see, every time you fail to root out the fraud simply migrates. It migrates from the lending process to the foreclosure process and the servicing process. Frauds, as long as they're kept there, will use the skills they developed, and the skills they've developed are making really, really, really bad loans that violate the law. So they are an incredible threat to the system.